I'm Nikhil.
And I'm Shankar. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 26. Me or we? My space or our space?
And we're not talking about MySpace, the old social media company, but actually MySpace, like the actual space around me.
Yeah, I vaguely remember something about a company called MySpace. Was that the predecessor of Facebook, Nikhil?
That's right, Shankar. We will get into social media sooner or later, I think, in this little discussion. But Shankar, a couple of episodes ago, you teased that one of my reflections on the travelogue episode, while you were in Costa Rica, gave you an idea for a new topic. And I think it's time to finally reveal what that topic is.
Yeah, that's right, Nikhil. So you were telling me about all the stuff you went through as you were moving into a new house. And one thing you highlighted in one of those audio clips you sent over was the interdependency that it made you aware of, in the sense that your house prep depended on so many people and supplies and their schedules and timelines and all that stuff. And that got me to thinking about the reading we'd been doing related to our coaching project, which was Hofstede's work on cultural dimensions, and how culture affects sort of management in multinational corporations and stuff like that, and how this individualist versus collectivist thinking is sort of a cultural dimension itself. And also, that's in the end seemed to connect up with one of our listeners, Rama's um, request that we look at the topic of private space, right?
That's right. And this is a really rich topic, so this will be a multi-part series. You'll hear part one today. On today's episode, we'll chat about our experiences growing up in individual and collective spaces, and hopefully share some fun and relatable stories along the way.
We'll come back at the end to wrap things up. So here we go.
Okay, we're here. We're live. So today we're talking about a number of topics. So Shankar, you and I have been working on research papers related to South Asian culture and American culture for our coaching program. It's been a long journey, but we discovered some interesting things that we wanted to maybe talk about on the podcast, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and some of the main ones I think you and I both found in our papers was around different cultural values between South Asian countries and America. And the big one was around individual versus collectivism.
Yeah.
This is such a fascinating, stark difference between the two countries.
Yeah, and I think intuitively we knew this even when we first came to the US and in our various discussions.
Right.
But I think seeing it mapped out so clearly in peer-reviewed research work related to management was somehow more evidence-based and grounded rather than just our individual or anecdotal experience.
Right. Yeah. So should we define individualism and collectivism for the group?
Please go ahead, Nikhil.
Okay. So individualism is placing greater importance on attaining personal goals, and collectivism is placing greater importance on goals and focusing on the well-being of the group. There's a lot of research. There's a researcher called Gert Hofstede originally from the 70s and 80s, who researched this as one of 6 cultural dimensions to categorize different nations. And so there's a lot of good research from him, right? And a lot of his contemporaries on individualism versus collectivism, nation by nation.
Yeah, I think it was pretty groundbreaking in the sense, as I understand it, that when we think of applying a management principle, I think prior to Geert's work, people thought that you could apply the same principles anywhere and they would work. I think the beauty of his work was shining a light on the fact that in every country the culture is different, and so one size doesn't fit all. And more importantly, of course, recognizing the important dimensions that distinguish countries.
Yeah. So his research showed that individualism is lower in South Asian countries and higher in America and Western countries.
Right.
And like you said, that's something anecdotally we may have known, but seeing it borne out in the data is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think we've of course, want to caution that the peer-reviewed academic work is very careful to state that it's a cultural dimension. So it applies based on interviews or data collected from a large number of individuals. And so you may think it represents the mean or the average of a population. Whereas I think what we are talking about in our podcast is a lot more informal and sort of how we see things and how we think a lot of people from our generation, say from my generation, sees things.
Right.
Which is again broad generalization again.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we can be a little more, shall we say, speculative and and individualist in our perspective.
Right. Yeah. And I think it also makes me think about the fact that there's a huge difference between these two, and that can lead to a bit of a cultural clash when you're toggling between the two cultures, right?
Right.
You mentioned that anecdotally we knew this. How did you experience the difference between individualism and collectivism?
That's a great question. So I think when we were growing up, at least in my family, I believe that there was a lot of negative value placed on individualism itself. And the very perception of America is that everybody is there out for their own self and sort of the Wild West. And here, on the other hand, there's a positive value to the fact that in India we think of family, we think of community, we think of society and the nation and things like that, which of course right off the bat I will say is not entirely true. And I think after living many years in this culture, I know there are many people who think here of the collective. There are many who are not in that sense individualist as characterized. And I think actually ascribing a value judgment to that experience or that notion is in fact in my opinion flawed. But I think growing up, it was just a stereotype, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But of course, my lived experience also taught me that in India we did live in a very collective way. So just to give you an example, when we were growing up in Chennai, we used to call it Madras in those days.
Oh yes, Madras is a better name than Chennai, in my opinion.
Oh really?
I think so.
Okay.
What do you think? I don't know.
Well, I think it brings back colonial, the idea of it was starting from a colonial name, whereas Chennai is Tamil.
Oh, I see.
So
Madras was the colonial name.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
what about before? What was it before colonial times?
I think amongst Tamil people, it's always been called Chennai only.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I assumed it became Chennai after colonialism, but
No,
that makes sense that they would change it afterwards.
Right. So, in fact, if as far as my memory serves, and I think it's accurate, there was a very large area of land in the south called Madras Presidency,
Oh.
and there was the Madras Presidency included all that area, very large swath of land,
Yeah.
and definitely a British name.
Mm.
But in we've always referred to Chennai as the city of
Okay.
Chennai. Is
Okay.
the way I understand it.
Then I like Chennai better.
Okay. So that's but we grew up always saying Madras because that's how we were. At that time, that was the current name. And so I remember we all slept in the same one room. And as those of you who are from Tamil Nadu know, we have this thing called pai, which is basically it's a mat made of natural fibers. And 4 or 5 of us, it's of course very warm in Madras most of the time. So you would just throw a sheet on maybe and lie down and sleep. And in a way it was very nice because bedtime is also the time for the family to sort of bond and chat and talk about things and joke, and you could all experience the weather together, we'd all complain and what speed setting you want the fans on,
That's true.
and how the mosquitoes are bothering you.
Yeah.
And there would be the evening ritual of applying either Odomos or one of those mosquito repellents.
Oh yes.
And then you had those tortoise sticks. They were kind of, the insect repellent. So you stick them on the thing and light it, and it had this really acrid smell.
Oh yes, I remember those.
So those are all shared experiences.
Yes.
And so in that sense, it was very collective. I also remember growing up typically in a multi-generational household. So
Mm-hmm.
my mother's younger brother lived with us for a fair length of time, and my father's uncle lived with us for some time, and my uncle, my father's older brother, also came and lived with us for periods of time. So even though it was not a very large living space, there were always different people visiting and spending considerable amounts of time, like literally living. It wasn't just
Wow.
like a house guest. There were people, and we were totally. It was the norm. There was nothing unusual about that, and we rolled with it. And I think there were positive aspects also. You got to spend time with people in your family who are not your immediate nuclear family.
Mm.
But I think when we moved to Delhi, then there was a lot of shift because we were farther from our community and from our very close family. This was, thousands of miles to the. I should get my numbers right, but it was, 2-day train journey in those days
Right.
to the north, and so and there was a shift. So we were definitely then a nuclear family, and the living arrangements were such that we had a separate bedroom for the children, which was a big change. And we moved from eating all on the floor, sitting on the floor around each other, to sitting at a table. And so I think those there were distinct changes in the ways of living that moved us from a more collective experience to a more individual experience. And to be very honest, I loved the individual part of it. I was so protective of my territory within my room. I didn't want anyone to come in. I wanted my own bed.
Yeah.
And so I'd be very blunt. It was not that I think it's a myth that everyone who grows up in that culture is going to think
Right.
exactly in that way.
Great point. So when that shift happened for you, were you excited right away to have your own space, or did it
Oh
take a
yeah,
little time?
I
Really?
was just itching for
Okay.
it.
You didn't miss the collective experience as much.
No, because I was really excited about music.
Okay.
As you can imagine, this started early.
Yeah.
And I wanted my own boombox, which is not a very big thing. It was not a very large music system, but I wanted it, and I wanted to play my own music, and I wanted to crank it up as loud as I could with the door closed, which of course I could not if we were in a collective space.
Right. Right.
So that was a big part of it.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, I was nodding my head and agreeing with you in the experience of sleeping in the same room, in one room. I didn't experience it the same way you did, because I grew up in America,
Right.
but when I would go back to India to visit family,
Mhm.
especially my cousins, we would sleep in one room.
Yeah.
And it was, my uncle and aunt and two cousins and me and siblings and all this. It was easily 6 people in one room, which is, there might be a bed and like a small cot on the side and maybe a bed on the ground, all in one room. To your point, we have to negotiate fan speed,
Yes.
maybe AC if AC was involved.
Right.
I think what I remember about that experience, I felt so connected,
Yes.
right? You all go to bed around the same time, because if anyone else is awake, you're going to be awake.
Exactly. The lights have to go off. at the same
Exactly.
time. Yeah.
And what's kind of funny looking back now, if someone is snoring,
Yes.
everyone is awake.
Yeah.
Right?
Probably.
You can't get away from it. Like,
Yeah.
you kind of
Unless you're the
know.
one snoring.
Yes, that's true. That's true. If you're the one snoring, then you don't know. But also if someone has to get up to go to the bathroom.
Yes.
So I remember some nights I would wake up and I'd be like, oh, this person's snoring tonight.
Oh.
Or, oh, this person's had to go to the bathroom a couple times.
Wow.
I mean, it doesn't really mean anything, but you just learn a little bit about the people you're
Yeah.
around.
Very intimate details.
Yes, in a way that you don't
Right.
in a more individual
Yeah,
setup with your own
right,
room.
Right.
And I totally echo the fly swatter with the the electric thing where it's so helpful so that you can flop the fly and you see like the electric net light up.
Right.
Yes, putting on the mosquito repellent before you go to bed.
Mhm.
I loved it, honestly.
Yeah.
I loved the change of pace.
Yeah.
To feel so connected,
Yeah.
and integrated, and seen.
That's true. Right.
Yeah. Do you think that so if the lights have to go off when the last person's ready to go to bed,
Yeah.
the lights come on
Right.
when the first person's ready to get up.
gets up. Yeah.
Do you think that just shortens sleep times?
I don't think so. I was a very deep sleeper, and all through my teenage years and whatnot, I don't think you could have work on it. So all this stuff you're saying about people getting up twice to go to the bathroom is, I've never experienced
Oh,
it.
that's so funny. Okay.
I just slept right through it, right
Okay.
through everything. People snoring, I don't remember when anyone snored, I was sleeping.
So you were the snorer then?
Probably. But the one thing I do remember is, yes, you can't read a book late if, and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
If somebody wants to go to bed, you have to close your book and go to bed.
Yeah.
And as for getting up in the morning, I know my parents got up very early, but they couldn't rouse me that easily. So it would involve a lot of threats, pulling the sheet off, saying that we will dunk you with cold water.
I was just going to ask, yeah, if they did that, yeah.
Right. Things like that. And but I suppose if you were not as sound a sleeper as I was when I was younger, then it could be challenging. But I never had a problem. Maybe I also think you become more immune to it, because
Yes.
when I go back, I remember now in more recently. So I have a nephew, and he used to stay up till about 2 or 3 a.m. When we were at his place, and he would sleep in the nearby room or even in the same room, and you could not wake him up.
Yeah, right.
He would just bundle up, and his head would be
Yeah.
under the covers, under the sheet, and there's nothing you could do to wake him up. And I used to
Right.
tiptoe around, and his mom would say, "Don't worry, he'll sleep for as
Yeah.
long as he cares to."
I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Right.
My cousins are very deep sleepers. They can sleep through so much, like a ruckus in the other room. And then, you know, when they would come to visit us in the U.S., my parents might say, okay, shh, Nikhil's sleeping, like, let's let him sleep. And they'd be like, well, why? Like, you know, you just carry on like normal back home.
Right. Life's.
Yeah, and they would sleep through it easily.
Yeah.
I wonder if that, you know, like you said, you grow immune to it. If you grow up, you
You have to sleep.
you have to sleep deeply because there's going to be noise around you.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have your own bedroom growing up from, you know, when you're young, then maybe it's more variable in terms of if you're a deep sleeper or not.
I think we're hitting on something here. I do think that there is a greater sensitivity when you live in individual spaces. And therefore you actually lower your tolerance for your ability to get along with a variety of different inputs. And when I say inputs, I think they can be physical inputs, emotional inputs, other inputs. I'm not saying, maybe I'm casting a little bit of a value judgment on it, I hope not, but I think it's an observation for sure at this point.
Yeah, and there's really nothing to be done about it, right? It's more of an observation than a indictment by any means.
Yeah.
But also riffing on what you said, I remember I was in India, my cousin was sleeping in the other room. The TV room is right next to the bedroom. So I think I put on a basketball game and I kept it low. I didn't want to wake him up. And my aunt came into the room and she was saying like, hey, why don't you turn on the volume? Like, it's fine. And I was saying, oh no, he's sleeping in the other room. She's like, oh, it's fine. He can sleep through anything. Like, turn up the tunes.
You're being encouraged.
Yeah. And so I turned it up a bit more. I was still... And to her point, my cousin didn't wake up at all. He woke up at his own time, at his own pace. And I was... Yeah. Whereas here in America, I would totally... You know, you have to cull the volume, especially if it's right next to someone's bedroom or a guest bedroom or whatever, right? You have guests. But there, no.
Yeah.
You do your thing and they'll do theirs and they'll sleep.
It's kind of funny. My daughter went to Tanzania last semester, and they were all out as a group and camping for a lot of their stay there. And many of these things that we talk about in India, they experience too, which is that, you know, how loudly someone talks or every, you know, sort of intimate detail of the, you know, noises created in the nearby tent would transmit, and they had to negotiate all those things. So it's kind of interesting, which we insulate and isolate ourselves from typically in the West.
Right.
So,
yeah, I also remember there's something about when you have that type of setup that makes you feel closer to those people.
Right.
So, for example, I remember when I would stay with my relatives and we would sleep in this setup and then wake up in the morning and then someone would start making tea or Boost or Horlicks or whatever the drink is. And then we would have it early in the morning once most people were up. Or if you got up later, you just drank it later. But it felt like a continued communal experience.
Yeah.
Right? Versus when you have your own bedrooms, you engage with people for the first time
Right.
at a certain point after you brush your
That's
teeth or
true.
after you shower.
You're
right?
presentable.
Yeah,
Right.
it's like a reintroduction,
Right.
whereas it was just a continuous song playing in
That's
some
true.
ways,
That's
which
true.
was very interesting and
Right.
kind of sweet in its own way.
That's true. On the flip side, I wonder about newlywed couples who have to share the same space with an extended family, which happens in places like Mumbai and stuff where
Yeah, that's a good point.
there's not much space.
Right.
It's a very small apartment.
Right.
And in fact, if you watch many of our Tamil movie songs and videos, they riff on that a lot.
Yeah.
Which is oftentimes the space is very constrained. And
Right.
so, I think there are pluses and minuses. Another thing I can think of is someone is trying to study or do something, an activity that requires a lot of concentration,
Yeah.
then it can be very frustrating
Yeah.
to have to experience communal space. So
Yeah.
I think there are some, I don't think it's an unalloyed good
Yes.
value at some levels.
Correct. Yes.
Don't you think?
Yeah. To your point, this is not to pass judgment
Right.
on either side of it's
Right.
better.
I'm
to be
glad you
individual.
enjoyed those experiences.
Yeah, it was a nice change of pace. I learned something. I think we're hitting on this idea that whether you're in an individualist space, if we can call it that, or a collectivist space, it does inform your sense of identity. It does inform parts of how you develop, even potentially to, how deeply you sleep in this case.
Right.
And I think that's so interesting.
It is interesting. And I think there are pluses and minuses to both
Yes.
sort of setups.
Yes.
And I think the ability, like I said, if you want to read a book a little late, or it's a couple, or you're concentrating on something, there's the advantage to having that the luxury of a private space.
Right.
And on the other hand, like you said, it can really change the way your maybe even the way your physical body
Mm-hmm.
responds or has to kind of adapt itself
Right.
to the space. Then probably that extends to the way we think
Right.
and the way we feel.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So that wraps up the first part of our conversation on individualism versus collectivism. What are you taking away from the conversation, Nikhil?
I'm struck by how fondly we both looked back on those family experiences and shared spaces. For you, more regularly, right, since you were growing up in them, and for me, when I visited family back in India, these moments really did leave an imprint on both of us. And I loved doing an episode that was almost entirely rooted in our story, Shankar. I wonder how our listeners will feel about it too, since we usually spend a little bit more time thinking more broadly or conceptually in addition to the story sharing.
Yes, I think sharing those personal stories was very powerful for me as well. I wonder how much of this cuts across cultures too, and I suspect it does. I'm also looking forward to hearing from our listeners on this topic.
Yeah, I suspect it does too. What are you taking away, Shankar?
Well, I thought this was a fascinating discussion, and I learned a lot from you about how being in a different space, my space versus our space, actually changes us in different ways, physically, emotionally, mentally. And at a time when loneliness is one of the greatest problems in America, we've actually had the Surgeon General say something about that. I think reflecting on these experiences is particularly poignant and relevant. And I found it interesting to reflect on the positive and negative attributes of living at either end of the individual or collectivist spectrum and having either mindset.
Yeah, great point on loneliness. I wonder what we in America could learn from more collectivist cultures to tackle this problem. Maybe that's food for thought for another day. And we certainly will tackle other topics in future parts of this series around individual versus collective space. And Shankar, we mentioned that you came up with this idea while you were on holiday. I think you join a long list of greats who've done this. Did you know that Lin-Manuel Miranda actually came up with the idea of Hamilton while he was on vacation?
No, I did not. But if you're going to mention me in the same breath as Lin-Manuel Miranda, I'll take it.
You are not throwing away your shot. To our dear listeners, we'd love to hear your experiences growing up in individual or collective spaces. You can reach out to us on our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or email us at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
See you all next time.